So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody, wherever you're dialing in from around the world. And welcome and thank you for joining this latest Alumni and Supporters webinar for Warwick University. My name's Dave Greenwood. I'm the Director for Industrial Engagement and the Chief Executive Officer of the High Value Manufacturing Catapult Centre that we run at the University of Warwick. I'm delighted to welcome you to this conversation today where we'll be talking to some fantastic guests around the topic of two of the biggest challenges for the automotive sector today, and that is electrification and sustainability. To those of you who submitted questions in advance, a huge thank you. We had nearly 100 questions, and we've based the flow of today's conversation very much around those questions. But we do encourage you as well to interact through the various functions in the Zoom conversation today in order to comment on what's being said. And if you have any additional questions, I'll do my very best to pick up on them as we go through. So we have a fantastic panel today, and I'd like to first of all introduce them, if I may, starting with Andy Palmer.
Hello there, everybody. Nice to meet you.
Andy, would you like to give us a little bit of background on yourself?
Absolutely. So I've been in the automotive industry for around 45 years. Started in the British industry with a company called Austin Rover, but then moved to Nissan and moved overseas to Japan and was ultimately 23 years in Nissan. And one of the areas that I was particularly proud to lead was around the development of the Nissan Leaf, the first mass production EV. I then moved on and back to the UK and became chief executive of Aston Martin for 6 years, and then moved back into the net zero space by launching a company called Switch that does the electric bus in London. These days, I'm chief executive of PodPoint, which is a charging company, and I have various non-executive roles in battery makers and just about everything to do with the journey towards net zero.
Andy, that's brilliant, and thank you very much for joining us. And perhaps I can next introduce Esther Harbell from Motherson Group. Esther, would you like to say hello?
Hi, and thanks so much for having me here. I'm really excited to talk about sustainability because in the past decade and a half that I have been in the automotive industry, I've seen this topic grow exponentially in importance. And I've started out, my background, basically, I've started out with Rolls-Royce Motor Cars. I've been in the Asia Pacific region and then also more recently in the bespoke department, where I've looked after the personalization of the cars and working directly with customers. And then about 6 years ago, I've moved upstream in the supply chain and joined Motherson, which is an auto component manufacturer, a large one at that. We're a $21 billion revenue company. And that means it's complex operations. So we're spreading across 40 countries and over 400 facilities. So I'm looking after sustainability strategy for the group and looking at how we can introduce new materials to the car components that we supply to all major car brands, and also looking at our operations and how we decarbonize through our facilities.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for joining us, Esther. And Aditya, please, would you like to say hello?
Thank you very much, David. Good afternoon, good morning to everyone here. Greetings from India. I'm joining from India. A little bit about myself. I am someone who enjoys cars, like I think some of the other panelists here. I currently work in Stellantis India. I head the India organization as CEO and MD. We operate 3 brands in India: Jeep, Citroën, and Maserati. We've got 3 manufacturing facilities. India is a global sourcing hub. We export cars to several countries worldwide. And more importantly, we export services to the rest of the world in terms of technology services, in terms of engineering services. We've got about 5,000 people in all who work in Stellantis India. My prior experience, I worked with another manufacturer for several years, the same manufacturer that Andy spent 23 years with. I was head of the EV strategy group for North America. before I moved to India a couple of years ago. And I'm a mechanical engineer, and sustainability has been at the heart of what I've been doing for the last few years. And incidentally, I also founded a company that was bootstrapped in the green energy space, where we traded in green power. This was back in 2010, where it was still quite a nascent space, and there was a need for green energy to be supplied to large corporations because of their sustainability goals. So very happy to be here and share my thoughts with all of you. Thank you.
Aditya, thank you so much, and it's fantastic to have such talent on the call today. The University of Warwick has about 285,000 alumni worldwide now, and if those on the call are any kind of test of the quality, then I'd say that's a pretty powerful network that we've created. So thank you all for joining us. So to begin with, the first set of questions that we had submitted in advance were really around the question of, are electric vehicles the answer? Are they going to be here to stay? Are the problems that people are seeing in the early adoption phase going to be resolved, or is this going to be an inevitable transition? And perhaps the first question to pick up on that has been very much around, are electric vehicles the answer, or are they a stepping stone into something like hydrogen? And perhaps, Andy, if you don't mind, could I bring you in first to give us your views on that topic?
I'll try. It's obviously a controversial question, and look, nobody has the right answer. What I would say is that I'm a great believer in the principle of Darwinism. In other words, it's really important that you're in an environment where you can test different technologies, and ultimately the consumer can decide which one wins. And in that sense, I applaud what the EU has done, insofar as it's been much more open-minded in terms of what it defines as net zero space. It allows for electric vehicles, it allows for synthetic fuel, and it allows for hydrogen, either combustion or fuel cell. Regrettably, at the moment, the UK has taken us down one route, which is EV. And whilst that might win, you always run the risk that there are some segments where it's not the right answer. Now, David, to your point, is EV the right answer? I'll go out on a limb and I'll say, in the majority of instances, particularly light passenger vehicles, I think that EV is the ultimate answer. And I think that it's the ultimate answer because you have no tailpipe emissions, and because you have a whole load of levers to pull to improve from where you are today. You can argue that today it uses more carbon to make an electric vehicle than it does a gasoline vehicle. And that's true. But ultimately, you can fix that problem by the use of sustainable energy in the manufacturing of the battery. You can argue that you have to mine the minerals for the batteries, and that's not healthy for the planet. And it's true. But at least I can say that all the minerals in the battery are recyclable. So ultimately, once you meet solid state, a steady state, then basically you don't need to mine anymore. One could argue that the batteries catch fire. It's largely mythical, but it does happen occasionally, and very clearly you need to put very strict standards around the way that you develop your batteries. You can say that the range of an electric vehicle is not as much as a gasoline vehicle, and that's true. But the solution to both the price of electric vehicles and the range all exist around fixing the charging network. You need a prolific network that allows you to drive anywhere, that allows you to charge quickly, but also allows you to downsize the size of your battery in the car so that you can make the cars more affordable. So my point is, for each of the criticisms, and they're legitimate criticisms of EVs, at least we have the technology in front of us to fix for most of them. Now, look, I still believe that that Darwinism is really important. I do think that synthetic fuels is a really, really interesting area, particularly for airplanes, air flight, air transportation, because you'll never make a battery that's big enough to take you from London to New York. So you're going to develop a net carbon zero solution. in synthetic fuels. And in some applications, whilst it will be very expensive, synthetic fuels might work in automotive. And I'm thinking here, for example, in the area of classic cars and supercars, where generally speaking, consumers have, well, they're generally wealthy people, and they're probably able to afford something like a 4 times multiple on the cost of fuel and not worry about it too much. But it doesn't work in the mass market. Likewise, I think the combustion of hydrogen has some interesting applications, particularly in off-road vehicles and perhaps in heavy goods vehicles, where the size of the battery is a definite downside for HGVs, where you don't have an immediate answer. And likewise, that might also lead to fuel cell and fuel cell use. But we'll see. I started development of fuel cells at the same time that I started development of LEAP. And the fuel cell development isn't really any further forward, whereas we move massively in batteries. So that would be my bet, David, that basically for most passenger vehicle applications, we'll move progressively towards better BEV solutions. But around the edges, particularly in things like supercars, sports cars, vintage cars, heavy goods vehicles, and off-road vehicles, there may be other technologies. Bring it on, let Darwinism do his job, and we'll let the market decide what is the best solution.
Thank you, Andy. I guess I'd like to come to Aditya on some of that. So particularly coming back to your point of Darwinism and letting the best technology survive, because that Darwinism takes place in an environment. And of course, the environment that the auto industry lives in is one which is also very much controlled by government policy. So things like the taxes that we choose to apply to fuels or the taxes that we choose to apply to vehicles. And unfortunately, they're not technocratic. They are very much policy decisions. And it's quite interesting to me, for instance, that the policies in India at the moment and the policies in the UK and Europe are actually quite different in terms of the way that they're encouraging hybrids versus electrics. And Aditya, I'd be really interested in your views around that.
Absolutely. So if we look at what's happening in India today, the acceptance of BEVs, right, 100% electric vehicles, has skyrocketed in the major metros, right? In the major metros, we see the adoption rates to be much higher than the non-metros. That's point number one. Second point, especially in a country like India, when you talk about commercial transportation of goods, there are three-wheelers, right? Tuk-tuks, who specialize in people moving and also in moving goods. The penetration amongst BEVs in three-wheelers is now above 70%. So again, this is point number two. And then point number three is, it's not that the non-metros are not catching up, but again, their adoption may be a little bit slower. But what does this tell us? There is a very specific use case. I beg your pardon, I forgot to talk about two-wheelers, right? India has the second largest population of two-wheelers in the world after Indonesia, right? The adoption rate amongst two-wheelers is at this point about 3 times higher than those of four-wheelers. Right? So what does this tell us? A country like India, right, with a large population, with populated metros, it is ripe for EV adoption, obviously at the right price point, at the right total cost of ownership, because the conditions are met. What are the conditions? Stop and go traffic. Second is a little bit of predictability when it comes to how much you're going to drive. And third, distances traveled within a metro market is limited, right? It could be 50 kilometers, 75 kilometers, not usually more than that. So because these conditions are ripe, we see adoption rates going up significantly. Now, do we see things going down a little bit? Perhaps a little bit, because now what has happened is, all those who are at the forefront of this change, all the early adopters, they may be drying up a little bit, and now we're getting a little bit more into mass market, not really into mainstream mass market, but a little bit more. So to convince them takes a little longer, but the value proposition, I think that's the key. Value proposition in terms of total cost of ownership. And second is the driving experience. I can say for sure that majority of consumers who have experienced a battery operated vehicle will not want to go back to a non-battery operated vehicle. This is because of the ride comfort, because of the instant torque, and actually the thrill of driving an EV. So we see in India, on the other angle, now we see regulation, right? What did regulation do? Regulation is now working at different levels, at the consumer level, at the manufacturer level, and then at the end of the day, also to the level of the battery manufacturers. So there is incentive provided at each one of the different points. And in my mind, these incentives are a bridge. You cannot have an industry that sustains on government incentives. But you need these incentives to provide a bridge when you're going from point A to point B. Now, I think it's very clear that by 2030, adoption rates will be much, much higher than what they are today, and the total cost of ownership of EVs will come down. The government incentives are to provide this bridge from now till, let's say, 2030 or 35, so that we are prepared a little bit on this path. Now, the other thing happening in India is also with hybrid vehicles. Again, it is not yet announced, but there is word that hybrids will also see some push from the government. But again, it is still hearsay. Hybrids, what it does, when you have a large market like India, it gives you that first step. It gives you that first step towards moving towards EVs. And then, it's kind of a stepped approach. Personally, I am not too much of a believer in the stepped approach. You have to embrace it. You have to embrace it. Maybe it's not today. Maybe you do it after a year. But you have to embrace it, because once you embrace it, there's no turning back.
And there are a couple of key things I'd like to pick up from that. One is the thing that you talked about, which is around multimodal transport. As you say, when you look at the Indian market, there are lots of two-wheelers, there are three-wheelers, there are lots of small vehicles around on the road. And that's not really a trend that we've seen yet in Europe or UK, although actually there are some really good things to be taken from that in terms of reduced cost of ownership, in terms of parking, in terms of the cost of running as well. Andy, I'm a little bit interested in your views around, is the car the monolithic solution for Europe for personal transport, or do you think we will start to see some movement around that?
Simple answer: no, I don't think it is. I think Europe and the US and other parts of the world have got into a very comfortable zone with the car going everywhere. I think when we look to the future, we have to look at multi-modes. I think, and at the moment we often legislate out of it, but an example of that would be, for example, electric scooters in the city, that last 1 mile, the use of delivery vehicles that are electric powered push bikes. I'm thinking of companies like EAV that deliver goods around London. I think the different modes that work seamlessly together. I'll give you an example. That basically you charge your electric scooter in the back of your car. You drive your car, you put your destination into your navigation system in the car. It automatically downloads to your scooter so that the scooter can do the last 1 mile. I think this multiple modes, including buses, trains, public transport, are really important. However, I think the most profound area of change will be what we know from India, from Japan, particularly, is the K car. And as we know, Suzuki Maruti in India started out as a K car manufacturer. The small vehicle with a small battery for city transport at a small cost, basically solving that cost barrier of entry, I think will become a thing. And you start to see it starting to come now, along with vehicles like the Citroen Ami, which is actually a quadricycle. So I think what we're seeing is, partly because of that need to address the carbon footprint, partly because of the need to address the cost of entry for these vehicles, means that we have to look at different approaches. And that means not being arrogant enough to think only of the way that we traditionally look at transport, but to look to places like India for inspiration.
One of the things that we talked about earlier is the fact that consumers will be those who decide on this. And one of the things I'm interested in particularly, and perhaps Esther, you might be in a good position to help us with this, is to what extent are we starting to see that consumer choice driven by sustainability rather than, for instance, the things that Andy and Aditya have talked about particularly, which is cost of ownership and convenience and energy consumption and these kinds of things.
Absolutely. So I think one important element is to look at where the driving force behind EVs and this whole discussion around the adoption rates, etc. But if we zoom out a little bit and look at, rather than just the use phase of the car and trying to decarbonize the tailpipe emissions and looking at the wider picture of product carbon footprint, which also comes, a massive part of that comes from the materials, raw materials that go into it. That's where we can still see the overall drive and trend being there in terms of decarbonization. And all of the car brands have actually mirrored that consumer desire, and they have set very ambitious targets for themselves around net zero. If we look at Mercedes-Benz, there's the Ambition 2039 to go fully carbon net zero by 2039. And then we also see Stellantis 2038, I believe. Then General Motors have brought it forward to 2035. So we definitely see all of these decarbonization targets. And what we're seeing is that these are driven by consumer demand, but also to look at the wider regulations and as well as investors. So specifically in the case of Motherson, where you see tier ones, that the overall industry is consolidating, and a lot of in order to be able to competitive and stay alive, that consolidation also then requires investors to be funding these mergers and acquisitions, and the investors also have that drive to be investing in companies that will have that overall decarbonization strategy, because unless they have that strategy, they aren't looked at as assets that will be long-term assets. So in order to then be able to unlock more favorable financial support, that's where having that strategy is so important as well. So I would definitely say that in terms of a wider sustainability drive, that's still there, and that's not going to go away despite different dips and ebbs and flows in terms of the adoption rates that might be going up and down.
So Esther, you spoke about the role of investors in this, and that's a community that's rarely spoken about in this kind of debate. And I'm really interested by the comments you made. That suggests that the investors are equating a deliverable sustainability strategy with a long-term financial sustainability.
Yes, absolutely. So they would be looking at whatever they are investing in, is it going to survive in the long term? And they're certainly looking at it from a point of view of if we don't have a robust decarbonization strategy, then what are we looking at in not just the next 5 years, but also 10, 20 years and so on. And that's where then a whole range of different things come in as well, around the operations, around how the facilities are powered, whether that's through renewable energy, what are the overall materials that are used, circularity. So it's a whole variety of different elements as well.
So let's talk about those materials for a moment then. So Andy, you mentioned in your opening piece that obviously one of the challenges that we see at the moment is around the comments on the types of materials, the amounts of materials. It's raising the question of, will the electric vehicle actually be as sustainable in practice as it appears to be in theory? Would you like to expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. I think there's a really excellent report that Volvo did that everybody should read. It was their view, trying to be as honest as they could around the sustainability of electric motor cars versus internal combustion engines. And the answer is, of course, well, it depends how you charge them. But you can obviously use clean energy to charge your vehicle, and that should be a goal. And the energy required to make them. And there's a lot more carbon goes into the manufacturing of an electric car than there does an internal combustion engine. Volvo said about 70% more. It'll vary depending on the sourcing of particularly the battery. Obviously, bringing in a battery made largely from Chinese energy halfway across the world has a big carbon footprint. So I think there is a lot of work to do in terms of reducing and hopefully ultimately eliminating carbon from the manufacturing. But that's a long journey, and we shouldn't be unrealistic about it. What we can do is we can make sure that every battery plant that we build in Europe over the coming 5-10 years is powered by sustainable energy. That in itself would help, and having them produced in Europe would help. On materials, as I said, basically most of the materials that are used in a battery can be recycled. David, you'll have a better knowledge of this than me, but the goal is something like 70% of the lithium in a battery should be recycled, and about 90% of the other minerals should be recycled. So the need in the long term to mine these minerals is much reduced. And I think, again, I hate to say it, but the EU is being very progressive insofar as they're introducing battery passports that mandate that you make it clear what the carbon footprint of your battery is, but also that you have this level of recycling in new batteries, and that's forcing the industry to look at this route. But the other area that one needs to look at is basically the actual minerals that you use in a battery. Historically, we've either used lithium phosphate, or we've used a combination of nickel, cobalt, and manganese. And some of those, cobalt in particular, has a lot of risks around it, both in terms of the very small areas that you can mine it from, but also arguably, or apparently in some instances, the use of child labor to dig it out of the ground. So can you get rid of cobalt? Can you use a different material? And there's a lot of work going on in terms of different chemistries. The two main routes, one, I think, which is the journey towards solid state, sees the use of a lot more silicon in the battery, and silicon, as we all know, is very prolific in the environment, less damaging to extract. So I think there's a route here which looks at the minerals that you use and makes them more sustainable. And the other one that is really interesting is LFP potentially being replaced by sodium ion. Sodium, as we know, is salt. Salt is interestingly the main product of desalination. The world needs more water, needs more desalinated water, and the sodium that's produced can be used in batteries. So the great thing about an industry at a relatively nascent stage is that there are so many things that you don't know. But as long as engineers are working on them, and as long as regulatory bodies are putting in place the right questions and the right taxes and barriers that let the engineers innovate, I think that we can move very much towards a much lower carbon footprint for vehicles. A long time to get to zero, but we can get a long way down that road relatively quickly. And in that sense, EVs are a very important part of that transition.
Thanks. I was really interested, Aditya, in something that you said around the slowdown that we're seeing in electric vehicles in sales at the moment. In viewed through a UK lens, we've got some really interesting dynamics going on at the moment, not least around the fact that we've got a general election coming up very shortly, where all kinds of different information and misinformation is moving around in the press about the benefits and the disadvantages of electric vehicles. When you talked about the slowdown, you talked about it really in terms of a market demographic shift, from early adopters into early majority. A lot of the conversation that I hear in the UK and Europe is around consumer confidence, around trust, around information and misinformation. I'd be really interested to get your view on that.
Absolutely. So, the torchbearers of the change, maybe we've run out of them. And what's important now to sustain ourselves, maybe not at the same pace, is better dissemination of how EVs work. Right? So it's not uncommon today for someone who's coming to buy an EV to ask, all right, where do I gas up the vehicle? It's not uncommon, as ridiculous as it sounds. But that's one of the largest inhibitors of growth, which is lack of education, right? But EVs are very sticky in the sense, you know, the more EVs you have, the more the education spreads and the more the adoption. So those education levels now need to go to the next level, right? Second is, you know, in terms of charging infrastructure, right? You know, I have driven an EV now for about 6 years, and there have been several instances where I've driven it up to 1 kilometer and sometimes 0 kilometers. But that comes with time, right? That comes with confidence. So even if, you know, 360 days a year or 350 days a year, you drive less than 75 or 100 kilometers a day, you know, you still want 500 kilometers of range, right? So this education has to spread. This range anxiety has to go to a education we need on range anxiety, because what this does, once range anxiety goes down, the actual cost of acquisition of the car will go down, right? You don't need to make that higher investment because you're not going to use it. It's like capital which is not well used. Again, for this, we need education. We need more users to start embracing EVs. Now, the third factor here is, you know, in different parts of the world, you know, we've seen some of the government subsidies taper off, right? It happened in China. It's happened in Europe. It's happening in India at this point. But then, you know, you can't have subsidies. You can't have these government rebates support industry. So what's happening? Yes, there is some correction in the market, but EV adoption is not going down to levels which in my mind are concerning. They're going down, you know, there's a natural equilibrium that is being formed now. And the other aspect which is happening right now is there are more options for consumers, right? You just don't have those 1 or 2 or 3 OEMs that have product offerings. Now, especially the legacy automakers, they have caught up quite a bit with technology, in terms of education and all the other aspects that you have with EV ownership, and choice is increasing. So I think this is a temporary blur where, you know, there'll be another equilibrium that we will have to establish where adoption rates will further go up, but it will happen in a more sustained manner.
And you talked in there in part about the role of charging and range anxiety and the consumer experience around that. And Andy, given your recent experience, of course, at Pod Point, do you want to talk us through a little bit about the dynamics in that charging industry and how fast do you think we'll get to the point that that's no longer the thing on consumers' minds?
I think the charging industry, the charging infrastructure is really at the heart of the change. So far, we think of it in terms of the change of the powertrain, but the change in the way that we make the infrastructure is really key. There are 2 fundamental problems that we need to solve for. Basically, the cost of the vehicle itself in most consumers' minds, and the cost of running the vehicle. Cost of the vehicle itself, the biggest single change that we've done, as has been mentioned, is to reduce the size of the battery, because for most of the time, most of us are running with weight and cost that we're not using. So, for example, whereas today we might have a 60 kilowatt hour battery in our ID3, probably we only need half of that. Let's say 24 kilowatt hours, because that's what was in the original Leaf. By doing that, you move from a £30,000 car to a £20,000 car overnight. But nobody is going to downsize the size of their battery if there isn't a prolific charging network where you can see and you have no concerns about charging your vehicle, or if you get down to 5 miles to go, that you know that you're going to be able to charge that vehicle. So the network, particularly in that case, the fast charging network, is absolutely key. And we've seen slow deployments of cash from governments in terms of making that happen over the last year. There is actually £1 billion of reserved investment in the UK that's not being used, which would have helped us a lot in terms of that conversation. The second is the cost of electricity. As we know, those fast chargers cost a lot. Home chargers, not a lot. If you can run your car off a home charger, then actually it's a very economic way of running your transport. But if you have to do everything off a fast charger, there's not much difference between an electric car and a gasoline car. So again, we come back to the charging network. We need prolific home, work, destination, curbside, and fast charging chargers, and we need intervention to make that happen. I noticed one of the questions was how long am I going to have to pay my taxes to pay for all this intervention? Well, we're in a Keynesian moment in the world right now. It requires the combination of governments and private industries to pull together, and that costs money. But it doesn't have to cost money forever. And secondly, I would say there's an awful lot of tax associated with gasoline right now, and a lot of excise duty associated with gasoline. So the gasoline industry, even though it's 150 years old, still has a lot of government interaction. But to my point, we do need a prolific charging network. There is some revolutions going on around the combination of solar panel, home battery, charging points, where it's possible to have what's called vehicle to grid, where you not only take electricity out of the grid and put it into your car, but at really expensive times of the day, you take electric charge out of the car and put it back into the grid. Again, to put that into context, these numbers are not exactly correct, but at cheap electricity rates, let's call it 7 pence per kilowatt hour. You charge your car and your home battery when it's at that rate. Then you sell it back when it's at 70 pence. And you only need to sell back 10% of your battery to pay for your charging. Therefore, running your car is for free. Now, that is the breakthrough. If you can say that for 50 miles a day, you can run it for free, then great. It also does a great job in terms of balancing the load on the grid so that you don't have to go off and build lots of new nuclear power stations. Basically, you just balance. And so electric cars have a role to play in that. And that's why I call this a revolution. It's not a revolution just of transportation, but it's also a revolution in terms of the way that we consume electricity and ensure that we're not building carbon emitting electricity production in the future. So it spans much more than just the car industry.
And what was interesting, you talked about the role that industry plays and the role that the government plays, but clearly when we're talking about behavioural change, it's the consumer. It's you and me and the people who live next door to us that will be the deciding factor on this. And whilst all of this is motivated by sustainability, we talk a lot about things like tax and incentives, and those are the mechanisms that governments use to turn a sustainability or a environmental benefit into something which becomes a financial benefit. And Esther, I'm interested to explore that piece from a consumer's perspective and the way that will move into regulation for sustainability. Do you think that this drive towards sustainability is going to end up more driven by consumer attitudes and consumer desire, or is it going to have to be forced by regulators in order that we close the gap between what people say they want for their environment and what they're prepared to pay for with their wallets?
It's a good question. I think it's going to be a combination of both, because yes, the consumer demand is there, but overall, if we're looking at automotive industry volumes, just the output, we cannot be expecting for the next 10, 20 years for those volume increases that we've experienced in the past decades to continue. And that brings up a lot of questions around how do we make things profitable. I've seen also in the chat that there's a lot around how Chinese EVs are bringing in a really low priced models to the market, and how someone's mentioned that they work at Polestar and how that's really making it difficult for them to be continuing and providing good quality but at competitive prices. And I think what's important, however, to look at is the competitiveness over the long term and the profitability of those ventures as well, because they are burning through massive amounts of money. And I think that then begs a question also around how can the automotive industry players look to be profitable in the long term? And that actually brings up another point that was also mentioned in the chat around a reverse supply chain, and how maybe it's not looking at ever increasing the volumes, and maybe it's not looking at year on year increasing the number of cars there that the output is, but instead looking at circularity solutions and looking at, okay, how do we maybe a manufacturing plant that is producing cars in the morning, can they be disassembling cars in the afternoon? And can we then be really maximizing this very high number of fixed assets and really be sweating those assets in that sense? There's a lot of different businesses that are working at this reverse supply chain, disassembling end-of-life cars, and then looking at gaining value-add products and then reworking those. And all of these actually happen to have great numbers of profitability, to the point where there's an example of this. One of our customers, Renault, they've got a facility near Paris, and of course, various different reasons, but the volumes have been dropping, and they've actually converted that into a disassembly facility. And the various portfolio of companies that they have under their umbrella that are all to do with disassembly, all to do with recycling, they're all bringing in massive amounts. They're massively profitable as it is. And so I think looking at these alternative models might just be the long-term drive for profitability, as well as then a sustainable solution.
And Esther, the things that you've talked about are some fairly seismic changes for companies, going from companies that build cars to companies that unbuild cars, but moving from companies that for the last, in some cases, 50 or 100 years have been driven solely by bottom line margin, and now having to look at some kind of triple bottom line or embed sustainability in a business. And how are you seeing companies respond to that? Motherson's a huge company. I can't believe it's easy to step in and say, right, guys, we're going to do sustainability as well now. How are companies reacting to that? How are they dealing with it?
It is a major change, and working in sustainability, making the finance colleagues our best friends is an absolute key element of it. And even re-looking at some of these models in terms of how can we be looking at a potentially longer term paybacks, and really opening our eyes up to what we could be looking at in terms of fees. Because if we look at just at the circularity element of it, there is an end-of-life directive coming within the EU, for example. All of this is where we might not see a payback in the next 5 years, but we can see paybacks in 10 years, etc. How do we adjust those models is going to be a key element to this. And it's also about making sure that we've got the right feedstocks, for example. So when it comes to materials, and how having so many of in order to decarbonize, which will really make to remain competitive, we will have to make sure that those feedstocks might be collected from oceans in terms of plastic parts, and those might be based in places like Thailand, etc. So it's looking at how do we then place even our manufacturing plants or different processing plants in order to ensure that long-term profitability is there. So it's a lot of different elements that really bring in this. And I think, coming back to your question, making sure that that it makes sense financially in the long term is a key unlock to this. I mean, just as a final example, injection molding machines, which is what we use a lot for various different polymer parts, instrument panels, door panels, etc. They just changing those means a 70% reduction in energy use, and it's of course then comes down to can we upgrade them faster, and how is that going to have a financial impact? So again, just making sure that from a finance point of view, it all makes sense is a key element.
And how do we make sure that this results in genuine impact rather than greenwash? I went to buy some motor oil for my motorcycle the other day, and I won't mention the brand of oil, but it advertises itself as a carbon neutral product, which I find quite interesting. How do we make sure that we don't end up in a situation that in the push to please the consumer, we don't accidentally do some stuff which isn't actually making the impact we say it is?
Yes, I think that's a very important point, and I feel that the consumers are really smart about it, and they are starting to be really in tune with what are the slight differences. So something can be carbon neutral, but then achieve that through offsetting, versus then there are the companies that are really driving at net zero, which means looking at how can they be as energy efficient as possible, and then offsetting just the final elements of what is left, what is just unavoidable. So it's elements like this where thankfully within Europe, there's very strict regulations, and they're getting more and more strict every year. And that's certainly part of it. But I think also the consumers, they're very, very informed. And I think what in previous years have been greenwashing is really starting to be cleaned up.
Thank you very much. And I'm just going to pick up on a point that you made around the kind of international angle on this. You talked about where plants are and so on, also changes the emissions and the logistics and so on. Perhaps Aditya, if I could come to you for a moment, how important do you see this kind of international and logistics angle on where supply chains are going to be located, and how the car companies will build up their businesses?
I think access to material, raw material, consistency in access, and then the cost competitiveness. All these are very significant elements. We saw during COVID, some companies dealt with the semiconductor shortage better than the others, and the reason for that goes into the architecture of the vehicle. If you're able to quickly adjust the architecture of the vehicle to be able to take what raw material is available today, then you can even increase your market share. But majority of the legacy companies, because of the platform on which cars are built, adjusting to what was available at that point in the market was much harder. So they faced these consequences of lower market share and lower sales. China, for example, we all know, has been working on this in a very meticulous manner, where they are going after the source. They're going after getting the supply chain augmented in a very strategic manner. And as a result of this, one of the components of why, I believe certain Chinese manufacturers have a 20 to 30% cost advantage is because of their hold on the supply chain network. And this is increasingly going to become important because from a cost perspective, pricing perspective, we all know there are very few companies that actually make money selling EVs. There are a few, but in order to be in business, you have to ensure that you've got a good cost base, and a good cost base comes from a strong supply chain. And I think this is becoming more important. For example, you've got large legacy auto manufacturers now who are venturing outside their comfort zone, right? Trying to tie up directly with the mines. This is outside our comfort zone, but you have to transform yourself. This is a paradigm shift that's happening in the industry. You have to do it in order to remain relevant and in order to be cost competitive. Now, the other element that I'll add to this is, the various geopolitical considerations. That is definitely not making things smooth. But, in the last 5 years, if there's one thing I think the world has learned again, is change is going to be constant, especially with supply chain, and you have to be dynamic. Post-COVID, we've had even more issues when it comes to the supply chain. We've had the issues with the Suez Canal. We had the bridge in the US, which had issues because, we've all read about that. So these disruptions in supply chain are going to become more significant, but I think we have learned as a race to be more dynamic and make changes. But I think this is a very important consideration as we move forward in terms of having a hold on the source.
So you mentioned a very interesting point there around the fact that the Chinese electric vehicle industry is huge and it's moving incredibly quickly. And if the dialogue in the UK, for instance, at the moment is one part of the dialogue is electric vehicles are too expensive, and then another part of the dialogue is, hang on a minute, there's a load of cheap electric vehicles going to be coming in from China and threatening our local industry. So you can understand there are two different policy dimensions at play. One of which is around leads to sort of protectionist behaviours and is around geopolitics of industry, and the other one is around the economics of sustainability. I'd be interested in your views on how you might see that play out.
It's I will say, it's sometimes it's a double-edged sword, right? So you've got, for example, I think it was yesterday where Turkey has now imposed tariffs, not just on EVs, but on internal combustion engines, 40% additional tariff on internal combustion vehicles coming out of China. So you have these protectionist measures. India, doesn't make it easy to import vehicles, especially from specific countries. But, I think as we go forward, we have to reach an equilibrium where these protectionist policies may become a little less watertight and will have business equilibrium. If something is not sustainable, we don't have business equilibrium, then whatever the considerations are, it's not going to be sustainable. We're not going to be able to move forward. So we have to accept, what the reality is and find a way to make things work. And finding a way to make things work, obviously, various stakeholders will need to be involved. It's the manufacturers, it's the consumers, it's the government agencies, the regulators. So we have to. The ecosystem has to operate in such a way that we find this equilibrium, which I think we are far away from today.
Thank you. And in a concluding question, just a one answer from each of you, if you don't mind. So here at Warwick, of course, we're doing a lot of research in this area. We're working on batteries, on recycling, on motors, on micromobility solutions, on government policy, on fuels, all kinds of great things. But if there was one thing that you could ask the university community, or one piece of research that you'd ask the university community to work on as the main focus in this area, what would that be? And I'm going to ask Andy first, if I may.
Oh my goodness, it's not very often I'm lost for words. I think the answer is, this is a soft answer, but as we said, we're going through a moment of tremendous change, and technological change, consumer behavior change, world change, and I've no doubts that that Warwick has a role to play in terms of the development of that technology. And I've no doubt that intellectual thought is really important. But you have a moment in time where there are lots of opinions and there are lots of different stakeholders, and none of the stakeholders can make things the way they want by themselves. A lot of people have to play in the sandpit together. And I think academia, and specifically Warwick, they have the ability to link people together, interlockers between different opinions, assembly of facts and not fiction, the interconnection between government, consumer, and manufacturer, and in manufacturers, the various levels of supply chain. So it's not an answer where you would expect me to say, go away and deliver sodium-ion batteries. Yes, you should do that as a university, but I think this is the moment in time where universities, and Warwick particularly, can sit at the center of the dialogue and can bring rationality, facts, and conversation to the table, finding the compromises between all of those stakeholder positions.
Andy, thank you. Esther, what's your view? Where would you like us to go?
I would throw in one thing that less dependent on consumers, because I've been listening to all of this, and it's become so apparent that the adoption will be so dependent on multiple different factors. But I think, and that's where, when we look at EVs, it's such a big cake to eat. But if we're looking at something that a university can be working on in terms of bringing some very fast results, I would say any technologies that help with saving energy on an operational level, to increase energy efficiencies. And there's so many different smart manufacturing technologies that enable that to happen. But a lot of these technologies, they happen to be more in the emerging category, and they haven't been quite adopted by large manufacturing organizations. And that's where I feel that a university having that connecting role between emerging technologies and potentially startups even, but then bringing and really linking it through their alumni network, etc., linking it to larger manufacturing groups like ours, it can really then bring in 20-30% energy reduction, and all of that really adds up. And it doesn't require anyone to be buying cars and large volumes to be happening. So that's probably my element to throw in here.
Fantastic. And Aditya, what's your wish list?
Yeah, I'll keep it very simple, David. Technology is advancing. Technology is advancing. However, one of the gaps that we face today is mass adoption or moving from niche to mass when it comes to technology. For example, solid state batteries. We all know that it probably is the next best thing when it comes to batteries because of the energy density and all of that. But the issue we face today is it's harder to mass manufacture solid state batteries. So I think where Warwick can play a very significant role is in aiding this shift from, okay, you got a great technology, but how do you put it into practice in a mass way where you can have high adoption rates? So I think Warwick has a great opportunity to be at that center stage.
Fantastic. And thank you all three for that direction. I think what I've picked up on from today is that we are at a huge point of inflection. It is a seismic shift, not just in terms of the product, but in terms of the way that businesses have to think and act as they go through this transition of technology and also with sustainability at the core of it. So the good news as a research organisation is we're not going to be out of business anytime soon in this. There is plenty for us to do, but it's about keeping it. I love your comments about taking it to industry quickly and take the wins that are there now, whilst also looking at that long term around making sure that what we do in research can transition into mass manufacture, and around bringing the stakeholders with us through collaboration. So thank you all of you for your inputs. I've got a little light flashing that's telling me that we're going to be cut off abruptly in about 2 minutes. So let me, in that case, please say a huge thank you to our three speakers, to Andy, to Esther, to Aditya. And then just a couple of things from the organisers. Just to say that this webinar has been recorded. The link will be sent to you afterwards by email. So please feel free to pick up on that. Please share it on your networks if you think that some of your colleagues might find it exciting. There is also a survey, which if you have a moment to complete would be really helpful. That helps us make sure that these events and the ones we run in the future are as good as they can possibly be. And we would say, please stay in touch. You can see the social medias up there. There's a QR code on there which you can scan and put your details in so that our team will be able to stay in touch with you and let you know about what's happening in the future. But with that, can I just say a final huge thank you to our speakers. It's been a tremendous time today. I've learned an awful lot, and you've given us lots of food for thought in the future. And thank you to the alumni team for organising this. And to the rest of you, have a fantastic day, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you to you as well, David.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.